I'm sure Jeff needs no introduction because I know there's so many people in the audience who've already talked about how much they love the book. But if you don't know him, Jeff's college roommate at Yale University was Robert Peace, a brilliant and determined student from one of Newark's most challenged neighborhoods. Peace's violent and untimely death at the age of 30 prompted Hobbs to research his life, explore the different worlds that he straddled, and write the remarkable and prize-winning The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. Hobbs spent his college career studying English literature. At Yale, he got only a glimpse into the troubled, drug-riddled world of his roommate. Hobbs now lives in Los Angeles with his wife and his 2 children. When I read Hobbs' biography, I wasn't surprised to learn that he had studied English literature. It explains the lyric and poetic voice he used to tell the story, and the empathy that allowed him to write it with perfect pitch. Jeff Hobbs.
Thank you so much, Dawn, Sue Ellen, Wendy, everybody here, and all of you for coming over. I know we're competing with a very beautiful day, and this is my first time to Martha's Vineyard, and it's beautiful. I seem to be a little bit allergic to it, so I apologize if there are any interruptions. And it's a real honor to talk to anybody about Rob Peace. He was my roommate for 4 years in college. He was a great friend. He bailed me out of fistfights, such as the time I was unfortunately hired as a bouncer for the Yale Symphony Orchestra's Halloween concert, and things went south pretty fast, which was good because I don't know how to be in a fistfight. He also talked me through heartbreak, also good because I didn't know much about girls. Still don't, even though I've been married to one for 10 years. But mostly we just hung out and talked about school, sports, life a little bit. He was a groomsman in my wedding, and later on we lived on different coasts and caught up on the phone 4 or 5 times a year. Not sharing very much because we're guys, and it seemed like life was long and there would always be time for a reunion. There wasn't. A little over 4 years ago, he was shot twice and killed by men in ski masks. This happened in a basement surrounded by marijuana about a mile from the house he'd grown up in outside Newark, New Jersey. I could speak a lot about his neighborhood, but I'll start when I met Rob, the way a lot of randomly paired college roommates meet freshman year, with an awkward head nod, hand slap. What's up? Let's get something to eat. At the time, I knew that he'd gone to prep school, that he played water polo, and he enjoyed hiking the Appalachian Trail. He seemed, aside from being black, like a pretty typical Yale student, and a progressive person might ask if there is such a thing, and I would tell you that there certainly is. You're pretty much looking at one. Rob was not typical, and not just because of where he grew up. It was a rough neighborhood. He grew up hard. His father was arrested and later convicted of a double murder when Rob was 7 years old. That didn't stop his father from using prison phones to go over his son's homework and instill good penmanship. Rob actually, no offense, he had very effeminate handwriting, little circles over his eyes, and he would sometimes even make a little peace sign inside the circles. His mother worked very long hours, not for much money, mostly in hospital, nursing home kitchens. She devoted herself to educating her son, starting with buying him the A volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica and getting more letters when she could pay. And he was very attached to his neighborhood and the people who lived there. But by not typical, I'm talking more about the fact that he was a straight A student in molecular biophysics and biochemistry, which is about as easy as it sounds. Captain of the water polo team. He was in one of those secret, not secret societies Very bright and popular. He had a stable of girls basically on call to come rebraid his cornrows, which took about 3 hours. Just nonstop chatter and laughter. Not everyone liked him. This was because he had very strong opinions, and when he disagreed with you or thought you were being a moron, he'd let you know it, and that wasn't fun. But he would also let you know if he was proud of you. That's very rare for a man, particularly a young man, and his words had experience, maybe even wisdom. And most people liked him a lot, and quite a few people loved him. He smoked a lot of marijuana, and he sold marijuana out of his dorm room. He wasn't quiet about it, all pretty casual, and I certainly registered this. It didn't bother me. It seemed like he was never spent any money on himself, so he was saving up for graduate school or building a safety net that maybe he'd never had. Probably not smart or noble, but practical, something he could do. And since this was marijuana and we lived in a college dorm, it seemed safe. Every night he hung up the phone with his mother and said the words, "You're my heart." None of this constitutes a typical Yaley. Any negativity, a huge set of discomforts that he experienced in entering a very privileged atmosphere. How to sort of contain the resentment for blithely affluent peers like myself, while at the same time, being very grateful for this gift of a education. It was actually a gift. This rich white banker alum of his high school saw a speech he gave and offered to pay his tuition on the spot. How to manage the guilt for his mother crying every night. The first 3 months he was away, alone in their house for the first time since he was born. The guilt for high school friends, also very bright guys who couldn't go to college for various reasons. How to avert the vitriol that a couple dangerous people back home started to target him with, just for the sake of being a Yaley. That must mean he thought he was better than everybody. How to ask for help without admitting that he needed it. I list these struggles, and it's easy to paint the picture of this brooding Hamlet sort of trudging around New Haven with a scowl on his face. But again, that was not Rob. He, again, was a bright light. He had a very high-pitched laugh. He laughed often, very diverse circle of friends. Any friction he experienced, he dealt with it invisibly and all but alone. From Yale, he took fantastic lifelong friendships with him, and he took the friction with him too. Excuse me. And because we couldn't see it when we saw him receive his Yale diploma in the spring of 2002, he seemed not just destined, but chosen to fulfill all of his dreams and all the dreams others had for him. And he didn't. About 9 years later, I was brushing my teeth, and I learned that he died violently, pointlessly, and very painfully. And about 6 months after that, I found myself in his mom's living room. I was there because of the funeral a few days after he died, alongside the towering grief, unlike anything I'd certainly experienced. There were a lot of stories being shared, mostly really funny and even joyous as the day wore on. And we took that grief and that joy home with us. And in the months that followed, people kept sharing stories on the phone, in person, on Facebook. People from all over the world also asking the hard questions. Why did this happen? A guy so smart, so many gifts, given so many gifts, how to get to this place, and nobody saw it. And at a certain point, I guess I blurted to somebody, foolishly, I guess, that maybe I could make a compilation of these stories, some kind of article, or just a stack of loose leaf paper, something more meaningful than a newspaper article that took the Yale drugs murder banner and left it there. There was more enthusiasm than I expected, and that's how I ended up in Jackie's living room talking about telling her son's story in some form. I expected to meet a still shattered woman, but she smiled. She was very gracious, seemed happy to have me. I was not reluctant, but I was trepidatious to be there. And I was upfront with her with the challenges and uncertainties. The fact that, it's very, very little likelihood of formally publishing anything this sort of sad and this hard. The fact that we would no doubt learn things that she didn't know, didn't want to know. And also, I look the way I look. She said, yeah, I'm sitting here. I see how you look. And yeah, a lot of people felt there was some value in telling the story of his life and not his death. And I asked if she felt the same way, and she didn't even think too long. She said, yeah, that'd be nice. Those were her words. And I think she was just moved that people still cared. So anyway, for what turned out to be 3.5 years, that's what I did. Mostly just conversations in people's kitchens, cars, offices, stoops, drug houses. I had never written nonfiction or researched, so this was clumsy most of the time, funny, energizing and cathartic, uncomfortable a lot, once or twice harrowing. Mostly like the funeral, it was very sad and very celebrative, and I learned the journey of his life. I think it's unforgettable. I learned a lot about this country, about cities, education, access, entitlement, identity. I learned a lot about race, and I mentioned this yesterday. When I first met Rob as an oblivious 18-year-old, I was glad to have a black roommate. I consider myself pretty savvy when it came to black culture. This was because I ran track in high school. Spent my summers in vans with my teammates. They called me an honorary black man. I thought I was down. It's hard as an adult, painful to learn how stupid you were as a kid. But it's also valuable, especially, again, if you look like me and you want to have authentic conversations about race now in this time, in the places where we should have those conversations, kitchens, cars, stoops, drug dens, why not? Rob cared about authenticity more than just about anything. Phoniness, being someone you're not, was a high crime to him. He called it fronting, and it really, he paid a lot of attention to it, especially when he had to do it, in environments like Yale. And so I tried to tell this story, for better or for worse, as authentically as he tried to live it, for better and for worse. We could talk about anything I just mentioned. I guess, like to speak a little bit about education in schools, just because it's so important. And Rob's story really illuminates. He went to, again, with his mother's sacrifice and some good luck and generosity, he went to a school called St. Benedict's in downtown Newark, New Jersey. This is a Jesuit school, all boys. It operates through a basically authoritarian control of its students, what it sees as its students' most precious asset, which is their time and their discipline. And, in California, our daughter goes to sort of a happy-clappy preschool, and whenever I mention the way the school works to parents, they nod like they're interested, but you can see little glimmers of horror in their eyes as they think about kids being controlled in this way. But it was such a privilege to spend a lot of time there. Um, it's this school. It was transformative. Even the school, about 500 kids, again, all boys, 90% black and Hispanic, many from poverty, many more from fractured families, fractured through abandonment, imprisonment, death. These are boys, the guys who run the school are these old monks with beards and spectacles and robes, but also a lot of young teachers, a lot of former students come back and teach. Rob Peace did, in fact. And these boys have grown up, faster than they should, but they're still boys, and they play soccer and hoops, also fencing and water polo. They talk about music and girls, a lot about girls, because it's an all-boys school. 100% of them get admitted to college. Not all of them go, again, for various reasons. And the reason this happens is because the faculty understands that the word help is not productive. If you trying to help a kid, then he feels like he needs help, and then he feels less than. But fully half their life's purpose is sort of managing a lot of unstable home lives, and they do this by keeping the school open and just by being there, talking, understanding. And there were rare kids who showed no symptoms of instability, and Rob was one of those kids. And he went from St. Benedict's to Yale, from a school of 500 to a school of 5,000, a school, again, 90% black and Hispanic to 90% white, a school where there was no free time, to a school where there's loads of free time in college. And a lot of people ask me if Yale failed Rob. Even the president of Yale asked me if Yale failed Rob a couple months ago. And it's hard to answer that question. I mean, I guess yes and no. But part of what I learned spending time there had to do, again, with this word help. Rob, again, very capable student. At the same time, Yale has this, any school, college, high school, has this extensive infrastructure to provide help. It's geared mostly toward kids who might experience a more dramatic transition to college. Writing tutors, cultural counselors, career services, more. And it's all there, and it's free. I mean, it's included in tuition. It's not free, but it's easy to access if you ask. But what I learned is that the kids by far more likely to ask are the affluent kids, the boarding schooler trying to turn an A paper into an A+, the kids who from the first day of their lives were geared to believe that adults exist to help them. And I'm not knocking that. In college, it's maybe the last time in your life where you're surrounded by adults whose, again, their life purpose is to help. But you take a kid like Rob, who from age 7 had to see himself as a functioning adult, and I don't like to psychoanalyze Rob, but it's pretty clear he saw a lot of shame in asking for help, weakness, even the simplest kind of help, like sitting down with a friend and letting them listen. And again, Rob didn't need much help, certainly, and certainly not everyone in college who's uncomfortable is going to struggle later on the way he did. But it's just really important to think about not just institutional resources, but the way young people treat each other. Nobody, again, is coming from boarding school to Yale thinking they're going to make somebody of a different skin color feel bad. But it's very subtle, and I think it really comes down to young people understanding that we all don't experience each moment the same way. It's very simple, but it's easy to forget that. In the meantime, the book has been out about 10 months now, and I've had it's been read a little bit, and that's been very special. More special has been the way it's gotten into schoolrooms, college, high school students. When I graduated, I was very intent on becoming a high school English teacher, but every master's program, fellowship, charter school I applied to just told me, teenagers would beat me up. I didn't have the chops, and I think they were right. So it's been special for me to visit schools ranging from Ivy League, state universities, small liberal arts colleges, historically black universities, bucolic private high schools, vocational high schools, Catholic schools, inner city schools, juvenile halls, and kids' approach to and response to this story varies very specifically according to the environment. But one thing that's common is across, I guess, what you'd call a socio-economic spectrum, is that something about Rob's story compels or even empowers young people to share their own stories in the form of a question or a response to another's question, or just a standalone testimony. Parallels to Rob or someone they knew, their parents, and I don't want to sound simple or something, and adults share their stories too, but when adults do it, we tend to be trying to establish expertise or authority with whatever pronouncement we're about to make. And I'm not trying to discourage anybody from sharing your stories later. It's just an observation. But with kids, these kids stand up 16, 17 years old, and they're just saying, I'm here. This is my story. Tell me yours. And again, it's astonishing to witness young people, especially young men, especially young urban boys, assume the vulnerability required to not just to share, but to listen. It's astonishing, and maybe not that surprising, since this was a great quality of Rob's during his life. He really drew people out. He made people feel safe, unjudged. He was very curious about people, and when he was a teacher, his great skill was using his own experience to improve the experiences of young men. So whenever from time to time someone questions my intention or my skill or my right in telling this story, I try to think about that. Teachers from towns I've never heard of and states I've never been to, reaching out and saying that Rob maybe has touched lives, maybe even changed lives, maybe even saved lives. And I do think Rob would be very glad about that. At first, I wondered why this sort of raw response from young people, and I've come to think it has to do with answers. There's very few, if any, answers in this story, and we're all constantly fed answers all the time through our touch screens, the TV, classrooms, just people saying X happened because of Z, and that's that. Those lines here are not clean. They're very hard to untangle. Certainly factors, very relevant and worth discussing, very, very difficult to discuss. There's, again, institutional roles and shortcomings. There's the nuances of racism and poverty. There's severe lapses in personal accountability. Rob made a lot of bad decisions that he was, smart enough not to make, and he made them with very little margin for error. And there's also drug use, drug distribution, a lot of things. But above all that, there's just this guy, this special, complicated, flawed, loving guy who is living day to day, and he's making decisions, most of them probably innocuous as he makes them. He's trying to make sense of the world as it unfolds, and he's trying to sustain what I would call a romantic vision for his life. And we all know that romance is very important. We also know that it generates a lot of warped logic and and impossible loyalties, and it doesn't always end well. This is the story of a boy from Orange, New Jersey, who earns admission to Yale, flourishes there, and then he does what pretty much everyone around him tells him not to do. He comes back home. He's there for his friends. He teaches high school. He coaches water polo. He travels. He buries his father. He is present for his mother. He travels and hustles, and he dwells on greater purpose, and he stumbles through his 20s the way most of us have done or will do. And he ultimately places himself within the ever-lurking orbit of ruthless urban violence, and that's a really messy story. It's the story of a Yale graduate who later works at an airport hauling luggage on the tarmac so that he can travel for free. Story of a high school teacher, voted teacher of the year. Again, very good at it, but he spent a lot of those nights, selling drugs in places more dangerous than a Yale dorm. Story of a man who scorns abandonment above all things because of the way he lost his father, and yet, beginning at age 14, without telling anybody, he started spending his free time in county law libraries, researching cases and precedents. He just really trying to free his father from prison. He firmly believed him to be innocent. Knowing what I know now, mostly anecdotal, but it's hard to say Rob was wrong. He was never able to do that. It is messy being a person and having a consciousness and having values, often conflicting values that we use to make decisions. There are so many good decisions, so much good luck, so much generosity, humor, even hope in this story. And there's also a lot of bad luck, a lot of bad decisions. And that's troubling too. We all have bad luck and we all make bad decisions. I've very much made my share. Most of mine have been insignificant. Rob's bad decisions were life-ending due to circumstances he was born into and those he created for himself. If I'd written a book justifying those decisions in the context of how hard his life was, like I said, if Rob thought you were being an idiot, it wasn't fun. He never used any hardships to, excuse anything he did or said, and he wouldn't want anyone else to. All this book is a, honest account of what I think is a dignified and meaningful life, told mainly through the small moments, the sad, the funny, the tender, the frustrating, maddening, confounding. When Rob died, and still today, a lot of the talk was about he was two people. He lived in two worlds, and it's easy to talk like that. The thing is, I lived with him in a pretty small space for 4 years, and can assure you he was one person. He lived in one world. His world, it was a pretty big one. Contained a lot of environments and influences. Mostly he liked to hang out and hear stories, eat, laugh. He aspired to steer clear of the, harried, financially based lives he saw a lot of people living. He aspired for a particular kind of peace, and maybe he felt he'd earned it. But he ended up mired in the most harried, financially based, unpeaceful occupation there is. And it seemed like his story ended in that basement. It was the same basement where he'd once gathered with his best high school friends and tutored them on math and English homework. But I'm glad to say that it hasn't, and I'm not saying that someone needs a book written about them for their lives to matter. Rob's life mattered on its own, and he made a footprint. But that first conversation with Jackie, I was sitting there, and I don't have the words to express her dignity, her grace, her courage in doing this, her devotion, her loss. But she said that her lone consolation after losing her only child was that she knew he'd influenced a lot of people. And it's nice to think he continues to influence people here and there in some small way. He certainly did that for me. And if he could influence one or two of you, for the better, I'd be very grateful. And I thank you all for coming out to this. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Questions would be great if anyone has any.
I got a question. Great. I'm not sure I need a mic, but Jeff, pleasure to meet you.
Oh, thank you, sir.
I cried through the book. My claim to fame is I've lived in every orange. Orange, East Orange, West Orange, South Orange. My formative years were in Orange. Mm-hmm. And Central Avenue separates us from north to south. And I come from a middle-class African-American family. But I spent a lot of time on the north side of Central Avenue, which is where Rob grew up, with projects. It was an amazing city. We had this dense population of African-American middle class, and then we had, because this is a class and race issue, and tremendous poverty on the north side. And a lot of people that lived on our side didn't go to the other side because they were scared, and they would be preyed upon, seriously. I had a good jump shot, so I could go to the other side, seriously. And that actually saved me because I had a good jump shot. And I had parents who were very focused on education as well. And so your book, you told an amazing story, but you told the story of the crisis that still exists in our country in 2015, because there are tons of Robs still today. Mm-hmm. And I implore everyone in this tent to leave here, because it's an American tragedy that it exists today. And I would hope that everybody would take Jeff's book and become tactical. I'm a business guy, so I strategy to tactic, and do something about it. Don't just say, oh, what a great book. Because it is an American tragedy we are living to this day. And I'm an emotional now because I fast forward to today. I coach executives for a living, having had a long corporate life. And I seek out, I prey on African American executive men because they're still in crises in corporate America. And I try and help them and guide them. And it's very a meaningful work for me. And I also work at a historically black school, and I seek out the African American men because we're an endangered species there. My school's about 67% female, and it's getting worse. So you've told the story that now we need to act on. And so I really do applaud you, and don't let them knock you down. I know you're catching a lot of heck because of your color, having written this book.
A lot less than you probably think.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. But we need to do something, and that's, I'll get off my pedestal right now.
Thank you so much for sharing. It means a lot.
I'm sorry?
There are a lot of good people, and you say something has to be done. They need to understand some direction.
Yeah, what are the tactics, right?
Right.
Right. So do what I'm doing. I mean, one at a time. I mean, if we all do that, we'll help recreate the family bonds that they all need to thrive and survive. My wife and I, we do it one at a time, and we've saved countless lives as a result. And it can happen, but everybody's got to do it in America. Everyone, because we're all Americans, right? Even with Barack at 1600, we're in crises. It's crazy. To this day that we're still having this conversation. Your book tells the story. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I read your book and I thought it was incredibly moving, and I gave it to a lot of people who are doing social change work. And I agree with this gentleman wholeheartedly, but I have a couple of specific questions about Yale because I've done some work with social change kids doing social change work at Yale. The first, when I read your book, I was really troubled about Yale's response to his drug dealing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious, I felt like they didn't really do what their responsibility was, and if they had, maybe his life could have been somewhat different.
Mm-hmm.
It's one. I'm curious what you think about that. And then the second thing is that I think there's an endemic problem with kids who come from poverty in the great schools in America. That's evident at Yale. There are all these programs. There's I can't remember what it's called, but the teacher. There's the mentor program. There's LEAP. More than I. There are endless programs. There's Dwight Hall. All this stuff that's done to help deal with the poverty that exists in New Haven. And my feeling is the Yale administration doesn't focus enough on what they need to do to help the kids who are actually enrolled get the support that they need so that they can go out into life and be fully functioning. I'm curious what you think about that.
Thank you so much. And the first half of your question concerns a risk of spoilers, but it's maybe the most controversial part of the book. He was caught at Yale by faculty for selling weed, brought in to a dean's office, and that's punishable by automatic expulsion. But they didn't do that. They talked to him about it. They said he's better than this. They told him to stop. He said sure. He didn't. And to me that's a very human decision made by the dean. Maybe understanding that you send Rob home, it's a lot more difficult to regroup and sort of get it together again. But there was still no oversight after that, or even if anybody talked to me or his other close friends, we were all very oblivious, as I mentioned, to what he was doing and the ramifications of that. So again, it's one of those things that are hard to answer. If they'd sent him home, who knows what would have happened. But yeah, certainly, and this sort of ties into the second half of your question. I know a lot of people, smart, sensitive people at Yale, work very hard on this issue, I guess, for many years. If it was easy to fix, they certainly would have fixed it. And like I said, so much of it is social and how young people treat each other. But the sort of attitude that, the education is a gift and Rob should be grateful and take his diploma and say thank you and sort of walk off into the sunset. And, a lot of people subscribe to that framework, and some people at talks like this can get very fired up about it. But I've had dialogues with college presidents talking about ways where even that simple thing, the exit, could just be made nicer. Bring kids back, or some sort of a Big Brother equivalent program with alumni, and like I said, just have people talking and sharing stories. I spoke to so many dozens of classmates who shared some parallel with Rob, whether poverty or just the stress of the city, and they're all living successful lives. They have homes and families and jobs they like. But every single one that I spoke to, once the topic came up through Rob, began to express this very powerful isolation that still trails them 15 years later. And I was friends with them, and I didn't know it. They did not want me to know it, because once you start telling people you feel isolated, then you don't belong, and everybody wants to belong. Sorry, I think we have time for one more question, maybe a quick one, or not. Thank you all so much for coming to this. Really appreciate it.